Preparing to live stream, setting up, redirecting.
There we go.
There we go.
Looks like we're on.
All right. Beautiful. Okay, I'm going to switch over to Zoom so I don't see that. And just stare at your ugly mug, and then we'll be ready to go.
Sounds good to me.
Oh, look, it even says live on YouTube in the top corner there of Zoom. Imagine that.
So, what's going on? How was your Christmas?
Christmas was good. It was different as it is for everyone, but relaxing. In fact, I have a week off right now, so it's been very good. How about you?
Well, pretty uneventful. You know, sitting home by myself. Didn't do too much. Zoomed with the family on Christmas Eve. Briefly. Christmas Day. Big couch potato Christmas Day. On the bright side, though, the World Juniors started. So things are starting to look like they're getting back to normal. There's light at the end of the tunnel.
Are the Americans eliminated yet?
Oh, I don't know. I haven't been too impressed. They lost to the Soviets. Russia, I guess I should be diplomatic. They didn't look too good in that game, but Russia looked pretty good. They beat Austria really good. I think it was like 11-0 or 12-0. But Austria was not good.
You know, I'm not really interested. I was just being polite. So.
Well, I don't care.
Okay. So what are we talking about tonight? What's the deal?
Well, you want to get right down to business.
Right down. We went too long last week, so let's.
Yeah. Okay.
I got to keep you on track tonight.
Okay. Whatever. Four Eyes.
Yeah, here we go.
Well, why don't you start? I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about our conference that we have coming up. And since this was kind of your master idea, maybe you could say a few things about it.
Yeah, we're excited about what did we call it? New Horizons in Early Christian Studies.
It's a stupid name, but that's what we've got.
Yeah, that's what it's at. So yeah, March 26, 27, 28, somewhere in there. We're
26th and 27th.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, no, we're excited about that. And you're right, I've been dreaming and scheming of such a conference for Southern Ontario here for the last number of years. And I mean, as you know, when you were applying to grad schools, Toronto does have, you know, a reputation as a place where such study has occurred in the past, and at one time was quite thriving. But, you know, there hasn't been a whole lot the past decade. So I was eager to see what kind of response we'd get, and it's been good. So I'm very excited. Why don't you tell them about the speakers we have? That's one of the best parts.
Well, let's see here. We've got coming in for a keynote, Peter Martins down at St. Louis University. You wanted to orient this in the Canadian context, you know, CanCon, as you guys call it up here. So I figured he was like the first one that came to mind. So I sent him an email and he responded right away. I couldn't believe it. So you got him coming up to do the keynote, the big address.
Good Manitoba boy, yes.
Yep, Winnipeg. Let's see. Then we have two invited speaker sessions. Robin Darling-Young, very excited for her to come up here. Going to be talking to us about Evagrius. Lewis Ayres, another one that I'm extremely excited is going to come, talking about racehorse mall, I believe, right? Is that what that's what his idea was?
Yes, yes, something to that effect.
Brian Matz and Basil of Caesarea. Let's see, Lincoln Blumel, going to be talking about Didymus the Blind and his fascinating lectures on the Psalms that were discovered fairly recently. Bob Kitchen is going to talk about the Syriac Church Councils. I'm leaving somebody out. Andrew Faulkner is going to be talking about Apollinaris of Laodicea and his metaphrasis on the Psalms. So we've got a good group, two good groups. And I think what we're hoping for is that we can have discussions that really focus on central issues going forward in the field of patristics or early Christian studies.
Yeah, I'm excited as well. Like you said, we have the two groups, and then each of those groups has a respondent, of course. And the interesting, I just thought of this, the interesting thing about our two respondents is they are both executives for our sponsoring groups. Mona is the president of the Canadian Patristic Society, so she'll be giving one response paper to three of the speakers you mentioned. Yep. And then Rick, what's his role again? Either way, he's on the executive of the North American Patristic Society.
Right. He's the treasurer, I believe.
Right. So yeah, of those 8 senior scholars, plus Peter, we have, I don't think Andrew's Canadian though, but he teaches up here, right?
Yeah, he's at Waterloo. That's a good question. I think he did say he was Canadian, didn't he?
Oh, I thought he said he wasn't, but either way.
Either way, yeah.
And certainly Peter and Bob and
Mona
and Lincoln, I believe.
Well, Lincoln did his PhD at the University of Toronto. I don't know exactly where he's from.
I thought he was from Calgary, but either way,
that could be. Yeah.
He's got good Canadian representation either way.
And then we've got what, about 32 other participants giving papers?
Yes, 30. I think we're at about 32 short papers. Yeah.
Very good.
So yeah, it'll be a great weekend, and we'll publish information at a later time about registration for those that want to tune in. It will be on Zoom, and we'll be happy for others to participate. And yeah, so looking forward to that. And I don't know, what would you say we, in terms of the theme that we were trying to pursue, you want to talk a little bit about that?
For the conference, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I remember when I was diligently at work on my dissertation in the Kelly Cafe, I received a text message some morning from you saying that we should apply for this grant through the North American Patristic Society for a small workshop or a conference, a regional meeting. And you said, but the thing is it's due today.
Yeah, that's right. And I don't want to do it.
I said, yeah, and you said, yeah, you have to write it. And I said, I don't even know, what the hell do you want us to do? And you said, well, keep it general. And have something about the Canadian context in it.
Yeah.
So I thought a general enough topic would be something like, the field moving forward, keeping it open. What are different methodological questions, that need to be asked? What are some lacuna that need to be filled in the research, which is broad enough to invite a wide participation, but narrow enough to keep our discussions focused. And I think specifically what I was dealing with, because working through the dissertation, you always have to deal with methodology. So what relationship or what relationship is there between theology, which is sort of the traditional realm of patristics, and history and theory, which are more early Christian studies oriented? Can these three kind of coexist, and can they inform each other in the field? That's kind of what I was thinking when I wrote the proposal up, and you seem to be okay with it. So I think that's kind of what we're addressing now in this conference. So now, not everybody is going to look at all three of those aspects. And even in some of the shorter papers, it's not required that they address those concerns. But I do think, at least in our focus sessions with the invited scholars, I think we're going to have some really good, fruitful conversations about what can be done going forward in the field of patristics or early Christian studies. That was the underlying theme.
Right. Well, and I know that at least part of our motivation, I think, for the theme is that we have in the past noted the changing landscape of patristic and early Christian studies. And, we won't get too much into that tonight, but I know that we've spoken and we have some friends that are very passionate about, just what's going on in our guild, so to speak, these days, and just the very different approaches. And so you and I tend to be, we love the theological and historical approach, as well as the many other creative methodologies out there. But there's these little bit of tensions out there.
Well, I do consider myself as much, if not more, a historian really than somebody who does theology, strictly speaking, lives in systematics. Right. But just for anybody watching who might not be quite familiar with this, the North American Patristic Society is the big scholarly guild for people who do patristics, which patristics traditionally is the theology of the church fathers. So however you define it, the first several centuries of Christianity, the major writers. And I'd say over the last 3 or 4 decades, probably, there has been a push to broaden the spectrum of research, to bring in more history. I think Elizabeth Clark once said, patristics needs more history. And as a historian, of course, I love it, because I think we can't do good theology without history. But then you get other theoretical approaches like post-colonialism and stuff like that have come in. And so there is a push to change the name of the North American Patristic Society. And I remember having a conversation with Columbus Stewart about this at one of the NAPS meetings several years ago. And he said one of the names that was proposed was the Society of Early Christian Studies. And he kind of joked to me, so we changed from NAPS to SEX. Yes. And there were a lot of people who weren't really fond of that. So we've kept NAPS, the North American Patristic Society. But then there's questions about, well, is it proper to speak of patristics when we're doing history and theory and stuff like that? So these are some of the broader questions in our field that are really kind of hot topic debates right now. Probably not too exciting for many people, but this is life in an academic guild. And so we wanted this conference, I think, in some way to participate in that conversation, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to that. I guess it's not too far now, is it? 3 months today, I guess.
Yeah, I still have to figure out what I'm going to write on.
Yeah, get on that, eh?
I have a couple of ideas.
Okay.
But why don't we turn our attention now to the focus of tonight? But before we start that, because we're going to talk about the image of God, because you had brought it up a couple of weeks ago at our last episode. But before we do that, I had mentioned a term that Gregory of Nyssa used, and I couldn't remember what it was, and it's epectasis or epictasis, which is this, for him, it's this ever stretching forward. He says God is in his allegorical account of the life of Moses. He says that God is limitless. And so the soul, as it advances towards perfection, towards its ultimate consummation, there's never an end point. So it's always stretching forward. It's always in movement towards the limitless.
Right.
That's the concept I was dealing with. Just to clear that up.
So, and as you probably admitted at an earlier point, right there, the classic example of Irenaeus really coming up with the concept, and then the later guys give it the fancy name, and then they get all the glory. So I get it. It's fine. That's how it works.
The first will be last, Don, and the last will be first.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So speaking about Irenaeus, so last time you had talked a little bit about Irenaeus and his concept of the image of God, and I thought that might be a pretty good topic for tonight. You seem to agree. So could you maybe expand on that a little bit more? What is this image of God thing? And talk about its biblical basis and whatnot.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's a point of and topic of discussion that is generated a lot of discussion, a lot of literature, and throughout the course of the history of theological writings, it's just proven to be very significant, very important, an understatement for sure. And the interesting thing for me, as I did some of the the background work and preparation for my dissertation, was I was quite surprised really by the lack of material evidence, the lack of citations and development prior to Irenaeus. Now that's generally true for most and a lot of theological issues.
What were Irenaeus's years again?
So yeah, he's writing typically, people figure between 170, 190, somewhere in there. And so again, as I think I mentioned last week, there simply just isn't a lot of literature prior to him. So there's not going to be any topic that's got mountains of literature or discussion. But it's not just the early Christian writers in the 2nd century that don't talk a whole lot about it. The surprising thing for me was to see that even in the Bible itself, there's not a whole lot of references to the image and likeness of God. You'd think that something that has generated so much would have a greater foundation and well to draw from. But again, it's not a lot. So there's a few problems with it as well that make our looking to the early church and trying to understand them. We can see the challenges as we observe what they were trying to understand themselves. So if we look at the scripture, for example, the classic verse is Genesis 1:26, right? Where the description of creation is described, and God says, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let us make him." So that's the classic text. And after that, there's very few times in all of the scripture where both of those key words are used, image and likeness. So there may be a dozen or so times where a passing reference to image of God is made, but not with the added mention of likeness. Now that's pretty significant in view of the fact of how later writers would make a pretty significant distinction between those and argue that it means something very important, whether it be the image referring to the natural disposition of the human nature, and the likeness as a reference to the spiritual element that is restored in Christ, or whatever the interpretation is. The point is that much is often made of the fact that Genesis 1:26 speaks of image and likeness. Making sense so far?
Yep.
Okay. So later in Genesis, there are a couple of further references to image and likeness. And this also kind of not complicates it, but it certainly doesn't make it easier for us to understand. The second time it mentions it is when it is speaking about Adam's son, Seth, and it describes him being born, and he also, it says, is born in the likeness and in the image of Seth. So, whereas we're typically thinking about that original creation of all humanity in image and likeness, and we begin to elevate the importance of these terms, we see that in Genesis 2, they're used again to describe Seth coming from Adam.
Do you have the verse in Genesis 2?
Genesis, what did I say here? Chapter 5, verse 1, I believe.
Okay.
I think that's true. I got a whole bunch of my crazy dissertation notes that I'm looking at here. So that's one issue. And so after that, there are not many at all instances where the image and likeness come again together. It's very rare. And so what you have, if we jump ahead to Irenaeus, is that unlike your man Origen there, Irenaeus is not working with the Hebrew. So he's got the Septuagint. He's reading these texts, Genesis, in the Greek. And if we look at the Greek translation of these texts, they complicate the issue further. Because what we have is, so for example, in Genesis 1:26, let us make man in our image. So the Hebrew there is Salem or Tselem, something like that, right? And the Septuagint translates that as icon, icona. Then when it says according to our likeness, it's demut, and the Greek translation is homoiosin. Okay, so that's the initial pattern in the Greek. That's what Irenaeus reads. Icon and homoiosin. Now the problem is, and again, I won't go all through it. We'll try to keep it simple here, but the bottom line is the Septuagint that Irenaeus is reading does not faithfully translate those two terms throughout the rest of the Septuagint faithfully. So sometimes the word that was translated as likeness, a different Greek word is used. Sometimes instead of icon, there's a different word there again. And so what Irenaeus is reading is not a perfect word for word transliteration from the Hebrew to the Greek. So that complicates it when we think, oh, is Irenaeus faithfully interpreting the various images or ideas of image of God throughout the Old Testament? Well, he was faithfully using what he had, and that was the Septuagint. But as I say, if we look back now, we can see that that wasn't always consistent. There was about 4 or 5 different terms that were being used interchangeably. So again, it just throws a bit of a wrench into it for us trying to understand it. When you come to the New Testament, again, you see that there are some different things at work here. You have a couple of references that do speak of man being made in the image of God. 1 Corinthians 11, James 3. The 1 Corinthians talks about the image as the icon of God. James talks about the likeness, again, homoiosin of God. So that's referring to humanity in that similar vein.
Mm-hmm.
But the more common references are speaking of Christ having come in the image of man. And again, there the word is typically the icon.
Mm-hmm.
But he's also called the image of God. He's called
it was it Colossians 1:15, he's the image of the invisible God.
That's right. Yeah. The icon of the invisible God.
Which is big for Origin.
Right.
I'll explain later when you're done talking about Irenaeus.
Yeah, and then the Pauline verses that are probably slightly, I suppose, the most common are those that refer to man being transformed into the image of the Son. So Romans 8:3, 2 Corinthians 3. Again, here both words, icon and homoiosin, are used to describe this concept. So I'll just sort of leave it at that. And again, the big thing that we see from that is the understanding that for Irenaeus, what he had received, the scriptural tradition, was certainly a very important concept, describing this significant connection between creator and created, God pouring himself into the human person in a very significant way and using these key words. But the usage and consistency of those words, and then the later translation of them, is really a complicated process and tradition that he would have received. So you're still tracking with me so far?
I'm tracking you, baby.
Okay. So predictably then, around the year 180, Irenaeus also receives a variety of traditions of how those before him understood this idea of the image of God. Now, no one wrote on it a whole lot. I mean, compared to him, again, my whole dissertation is on him and this text, Genesis 1:26.
Well, Philo did.
Right. And in terms of the Christian writers before him, it's very limited. And so I think even in, let me think here, in book 3 alone of Against Heresies, he probably says more about the image of God than anyone before him whose literature we still have. So just to summarize a few of the ideas that predated him. One of the important ideas that he inherited was establishing or suggesting a connection between this idea that humanity was created in the image and believing that it had something to do with morality or virtue, and that this was one of the distinguishing features of the human race that set it apart from any other creature. So you'll see this, for example, in Clement of Rome, who does talk about both very briefly, but he talks about God forming that first man with his hands in his own image, according to his likeness. And Clement quickly talks about that in the context that we ourselves are meant to conform ourselves with all diligence to that will of the Creator, and with all of our strength to pursue works of righteousness. So doesn't really elaborate on, again, what does it mean that I'm in the divine image? He just links it immediately to the pursuit of his righteousness.
So he's only concerned, well, he's primarily concerned with the ethical implications of it.
Right. That's right. And he wouldn't be the last to do that. Again, there's another little tract, the Epistle of, how do you say that? Diognetus?
Close enough, yeah.
Close enough. He also talks about the idea that we are formed after his image. He doesn't mention the likeness, but he too talks about it in the larger context of being those who imitate this God who has formed us.
So can I just interrupt you here for a second, because I think you're talking about something that's pretty important.
Yep.
So this word likeness, this homeosis, and here's where we get into this issue of what these early Christians had to deal with, because for them, their authoritative text was the Greek Septuagint, the authoritative Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which has homeosis.
Wow.
And most of these writers, Irenaeus included, but Origen, Clement, would have known Plato. And for Plato, who says the end for man is the likeness to God, homeosis. So they see in this sort of a biblical precursor to Plato's understanding of what the natural end for man is. And I think this is important because we're talking about this world of translation where we're taking Hebrew terms but putting them into a Greek vocabulary, which influences thought. So it does really do give it a moral significance, where there's an aspect of imitation that is at play here, or participation is another key term they used.
Yeah, for sure. And like you mentioned earlier, Philo also has much to say on this. Mm-hmm. But maybe before we touch on that, I'm not going to go through all of the texts that.
Please don't. We don't really have enough time for that. But the kind of the general overall picture, like what is Irenaeus getting at in his when he talks about the image and likeness?
Yeah. Well, again, just 2 comments before we touch back on Irenaeus is, so again, the interesting thing is that I would say almost all of the major writers that we have prior to him, Ignatius, Justin, they all allude to this concept. Athenagoras, Theophilus, they all touch on it from time to time, often just even one time. And so for them, it's frequently, like I said, about either concerned about those ethics, or it is really centering on the idea of human rationality and the mind, and that the principle factor that distinguishes, again, the human race is that mind that God gave us, the freedom of the will, that often is very much central. And the other, you mentioned Platonic thinking. The other really interesting character who says the most prior to Irenaeus would be Tatian.
Justin, student.
That's right. And so, again, we won't get into the whole background of his life, but one of the reasons that has been suggested that Tatian was sort of he was essentially viewed later as holding heretical beliefs and potentially even quasi-Gnostic beliefs, some would say. A lot of this actually, some of it tied in to his interactions with this idea of the image and likeness. So, for example, he would talk about the fact that since humanity was made in the image of God, that this speaks to the immortality within the human race, and linking it to the incorruption that the divine himself has, that there is also this element in humanity, a principle. The soul, he says, is not in itself immortal, and yet, Tatian would say, it is possible not to die. And so he really began to push things a lot further than had previously occurred, where half the time Genesis 1:26 would just be referenced almost in passing as the writer looked for some excuse, not excuse, but as whether it was Ignatius or Justin, and they're speaking about any type of divine or righteous quality in man, they would link it back and say, such as he was created in the image and likeness.
So they weren't saying that the human body, was the image of God.
Most of them are not saying that. Correct.
Because they're very concerned with anthropomorphism, or depicting God in human form, which was always a hot topic of debate back then.
Right. No. And that's what makes Irenaeus so interesting, is because he, probably more so than any before him, he was fascinated and really emphasized the goodness of the material of the body. Did we touch on that a little bit 2 weeks ago? I can't even remember.
Yeah.
So stop me if we've already covered this, but Irenaeus had this unique concept of, almost in a sense, back to the future-ish, in that he saw Adam's formation as, yes, literally the image is in part a physical resemblance. A resemblance to what? A resemblance to the incarnate Christ that would one day appear, but that was the template that Irenaeus argued was that physical resemblance that humanity would take up. Actually, that of the incarnation. So again, chicken before the egg, whatever. But so for him, there was an aspect of a physical resemblance. He doesn't dwell on it a whole lot. And I mean, the whole point of my dissertation, as I mentioned last time, was to argue that he is not overly preoccupied with these strict definitions what exactly does he mean by reference to the icon of God or the likeness? It's the bigger picture. But in terms of that image, there was that interesting idea that he had. Well, yeah, the Father, as he fashioned things, as he molded things, he had in view the incarnation and the form that the Word would take up. So that's kind of interesting. And so again, I don't want to cover all the same ground, but whereas Tatian had begun to really explore these ideas in a different way than had occurred before, this immortality of the soul, and beginning to, in a sense, denigrate the flesh in a way that would certainly be much more explicit in some of Irenaeus's other opponents that he's interacting with. But as Tatian would touch on this as well, and talking about the flesh of man. And so Irenaeus receives all of this. He receives the tradition about ethics and virtue. He receives the emphasis on the rationality and the freedom of the will. He understands, again, this idea of being in God's image and having ideas about an actual physical connection. And then the ideas about the Spirit and the relationship between the Holy Spirit, the breath of the Spirit, the gift of the Spirit, and this spiritual likeness. And he takes all of it and, in some respects, throws it into a bit of a blunder and draws on all of these concepts, really, to do, as I said last time, to variously argue for that significant, imminent connection and good connection between the Creator and his creation, and that there was something sacred about the human race. There was a connection and resemblance that was not present in any other aspect of creation.
Which I suppose would make sense, because he's really trying to argue with Gnostics and the sort of intellectual descendants of Marcion, who all of whom were, kind of held this body soul dualism, where the body had somehow was bad almost intrinsically. Right. So his attempt then to dignify the material or the body itself in this, I think that it makes a bit of sense in light of his intellectual interlocutors.
Yeah, I mean, just it's remarkable how much of what he says. I mean, it really is, on so many levels, a direct response to these opponents of his, and so that can be the challenge of weeding out. And sometimes it actually is even difficult reading Irenaeus, because he just moves so quickly between his summary of those he's critiquing with his own thoughts and then quotes, and then the scripture. The way he draws from scripture is certainly not the way most of us would do it today. So it's quite an experience trying to work through all of that, for sure.
Well, it seems to me, the way you're describing Irenaeus here and his treatment of Genesis 1:26, is that being created according to the image and likeness of God is really the basis of human dignity. I mean, would he make that connection?
Yes, yeah, for sure. I mean, that is even in the New Testament. That really is almost the primary way allusions are being made to the image of God. Is again just I don't want to say a throwaway remark, but you're right. When there's mention of human dignity or anything related to that, oftentimes, like I said before, there will be a tag on reference to having been made in the image and likeness of God.
Mm-hmm.
So even if prior to him, none really expanded on that or explained that, what it actually meant,
Mm-hmm.
that's certainly how they saw it functioning.
Yeah.
And even in Irenaeus himself, like I said with my dissertation, I focus on 10 particular units of text where he does dive in. But even for those 10, there's dozens of others. And if you include where he only mentions the image, again, it's several dozen
Mm-hmm.
just throwaway remarks that, again, like you say, are just about the fact that we do have a dignity because of the fact that we are made in his image.
Yeah. Well, in Origen's first homily, I think it's his first homily on Psalm 15, he talks about Genesis 1:26, and he's talking to his community. I'm forgetting so much of the specifics here, but he's talking to them about being a Christian is to be in Christ, and when you sin against a Christian, you're actually sinning against Christ. But then he says, but don't disregard what you do when you commit a sin against a non-Christian. People who are also created in the image and likeness of God. So Origen there uses Genesis 1:26 as sort of this, you could call it ecumenical kind of spirit or interreligious spirit. He's not talking about like the equality of religions, but regardless of what religion or regardless of what ethnicity somebody is or what gender they are, they're created in the image and likeness of God, and therefore they have this intrinsic relationship with God, which is the source of their dignity. So when we commit a sin against them, we're committing a sin against God, against the one in whose image they were made. It seems so striking that you say that so little had been said on this pretty radical verse in Genesis. Now, I told you before, Ben Shapiro said that this is probably the most important sentence in the history of Western civilization.
Wow.
Now, whether he's right or wrong, whether you agree with him or not, I don't think there's any denying that it is certainly probably one of the most important verses, anyways, one of the most radical verses in the history of Western thought. Just this notion, that we are created in God's image, it's kind of a radical notion to consider humanity created in God's image. Now, in the Alexandrian tradition, they're very concerned with anthropomorphism, like I said before, depicting God in human form. And I don't know if it starts with Philo, the Jewish philosopher in Alexandria, Egypt, contemporary of Jesus and Paul, probably a younger contemporary of Jesus. I don't know when exactly he died, but perhaps more than Jesus. Like you got the Gospels and you got Paul, and then you probably have Philo in terms of their intellectual and spiritual influence on Greek-speaking Christians and early Christianity. Right. Philo is probably up there, which brings to mind, I told you this before, but sometime in February, Mara Niehoff will be on here. I got her to come on for an interview. She's made her career writing about Philo, so that's going to be an interesting, I think, interview. But Philo connects the image with the mind, the intellect, the rational capacity of the human being. And then you get, I think Clement does the same thing, and Origen really takes us home. And Origen says, that God is a simple intellectual being. So God, the triune deity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Trinity, is really the only being that can rightly be said to exist without a body. That's the only purely intellectual, and by that he means you can only comprehend it in the intellect, in the mind, or in the heart, as the biblical vocabulary would have it. And he says, we have a natural kinship because we have this rational faculty of the soul. And he uses different terms. He uses the nous from Plato, the mind, but also the hegemonikon, which he takes from Stoicism, the governing faculty of the soul. Think of hegemonic is kind of, that's where hegemonikon is where we get the term hegemonic from. So it's the governing part of the human person, where we take in stimuli, we apply the use of reason to it, logos. So again, here Origen is drawing this Christological connection, because John 1, in the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God. And so we have this logos naturally, which functions as a way to make moral decisions, to judge stimuli, things that happen from outside of us, and things that happen from within, like a spontaneous image or a memory or something like that. We judge it and we act upon it. So that gives a real strong ethical component to this image of God. And he says it's important to note in Genesis that it doesn't say, let us make man in our image. Where did I put the text here? He actually he uses what I think is a Stoic theory of language to make its interpretation. So the fact that it says in the image of God, he made him and was silent about the likeness. So in the second verse, it says, let us make the human being in our image and likeness. Then the text goes on to add, and God made the human being in the image of God, he made them. So in that second part, it leaves out the likeness. Let us make man in our image and likeness. Then he made man in his image. And Origen says that's significant. So he follows the Stoic theory of language where, word order has significance. It tells you something about the meaning of the text. The fact that it omits the likeness, the homeosis, in the making part suggests that we weren't initially created in the likeness. We're created in the image, katikona. So this is, again, refers to the intellectual capacity of the soul, but we actually have to work towards the likeness. And in this text of On First Principles, he actually appeals directly to Plato, who said the highest good towards which every rational being hastens is to become as far as possible like God. And so that's for Plato, but he's giving it a biblical bent to it because he's talking about Genesis 1:26 here. And so he has this notion of participation, metochi, which means that, really the human being kind of exists in the midst of all different kinds of forces competing for its attention. And some of these forces come out naturally, like through our hunger, through our need for sex. Sometimes they come from without. So, when you give me a hard time, which you normally do,
That's right.
That makes me angry, so we get external stressors as well. But we also have things that are kind of like good things, good forces that are vying for our attention and our affection. And so the soul is kind of caught in this struggle between opposing forces. And so if we choose to practice virtue, and again, for Origen, God is himself virtue. Virtue is not a quality God has. God is capital V virtue. And then same with all the virtues. God is righteousness, God is truth, God is love, all that stuff, yada, yada. So when we follow those virtues, when we practice virtue, we're actually participating in God's being, which draws us closer to the likeness. That's kind of Origen's, that's like a metaphysical basis for Origen's moral theology or moral philosophy. Well, it's actually quite interesting, though, as important as this verse is, Genesis 1:26, at the end of the 4th century, we have the Origenist controversy, the first Origenist controversy, which emerges in these monastic communities in Egypt. And you have these groups of monks, some of whom are kind of schooled in the Origenist tradition, and then some of whom are not. Some of whom are like anti-Origenist. They don't like Origen at all. They don't like his spiritual interpretation of the Bible, this and that. Well, John Cassian, in his 10th conference, which is on prayer, he talks about this scenario where he and his friend Germanus are at one of these conferences, which was basically a group of younger monks approaching an elder monk, asking him all kinds of questions, and then the older monk will kind of give a discourse on a monastic topic. So this one, they're talking about the topic on prayer. And Cassian narrates this scene in a monastic congregation where every year the Patriarch of Alexandria would issue his festal letter, which would kind of give ecclesial direction for the Alexandrian church and pretty much the church throughout Egypt for the rest of that liturgical year. He established the date for Easter, for example, in these festal letters. Well, one year, Theophilus, there was this huge debate that broke out about whether or not monks could depict God physically through mental representations, because in their prayers, they would say, is it proper for us to pray to a mental representation of God? Not like praying to icons, which would kind of be a later development. And for the Origenist tradition, no, because that would be anthropomorphism. God doesn't have a body. That would be kind of almost tantamount to idolatry. And Cassian talks about this one Abba, Serapion, who was very skilled in monastic practices, very skilled in asceticism, but he wasn't too philosophically sophisticated. So he couldn't stop himself from praying to God with mental representations. So this got to the Archbishop of Theophilus, who was supposed to resolve the issue going forward for these monastic communities. Well, his first letter, which I think was in 399, sided with the Origenists. But the anti-Origenist monks, they had a pretty powerful lobbyist group. You think of like modern day lobbies that, are so powerful today. Like the teachers' unions or the policemen's unions or whatever unions you could think of. So they complained to him, and I think St. Jerome was a part of this because he was kind of, at this time, he had turned against Origen. Initially, he had been a lover of Origen, then he kind of turned against Origen when he saw the tides turning against him. So Theophilus changes his mind. And what ends up happening is a huge conflict erupts in these monastic communities. And the anti-Origenist monks, now backed by the Patriarch of Alexandria, drive the Origenist monks out of Egypt, fearing for their lives. I mean, there was a lot of violence that occurred. And so the Origenist monks sought shelter with John Chrysostom. But this is, you think, well, okay, the image and likeness of God. I mean, I had never really given it all that much thought before. I thought, well, before I started thinking theologically, I would think to myself, well, that just means that God made us the way he wanted to make us, and he was pleased with what he did. But for them, there were real implications for this, not just ethical, but theological. What does this verse tell us about God and God's nature? What does it tell us about us and our human nature? And even though they were defenders of human dignity with this verse, that didn't prevent, some of them from accosting, their opponents. But I mean, it seems to me that, if we read the fathers and what they have to say about Genesis 1:26, and we take it seriously, theologically, the theological implications of it, I mean, that can really give us a vocabulary today for dealing with some of our contemporary issues of tribalism and identity politics, where it seems to me one's group affiliation, whether it be racial, gender, political, religious, is more important for judging somebody's worth than their individual humanity as a dignified individual made in God's image. I think that's one way in which I think early Christianity can really enrich contemporary conversations.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot there that we can learn from, and even just the way they think sometimes is so unique. I mean, oftentimes we've heard the critique of these, especially 3rd, 4th century. I mean, perhaps no one more than Origen. The accusations of the Greek, the philosophical influences, and a corrupting influence. But what's fascinating is like you say, they take this biblical idea, this motif, and they really think deeply on it, and not just for the sake of being the intellectual equal of some great Greek master, and let's just think of the craziest things we can. But
Yeah.
like you say, they actually care about human dignity. They actually care about ethics.
Yeah.
They actually see this idea that we were created in his image, and therefore that should mean something about the pursuit of our lives.
Yeah.
And so, yes, especially after the 3rd century, maybe they start to really think and utilize the language of Greek ideas. But again, it's very much rooted in practical concerns.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it can be quite beautiful, but it is not without its challenges as well.
Well, yeah, no, of course not. But I do think, and I don't know if this is something I'll do for the conference. I think this is something I'm working on in a different project. But there's this notion out there, in postmodernism, that kind of comes from postmodernism, that truth, if there is an objective truth that exists, if there is, it's kind of irrelevant. What matters more is how discourse shapes that truth. So they bring in issues of power dynamics, like who owns the means of intellectual production determines, the truth of the day. And so this has kind of crept its way into patristics. And one such way in which they've done it is to look at race and how early Christianity talked about race. And oftentimes they've talked about Christianity as a new race. You mentioned the Epistle of Diognetus.
or the Epistle to Diognetus. He talks about this third race. And some of them have come up with this conclusion, that, well, according to the fathers, there's no fixity in race. People can change races. So they've said this can actually help us to overcome racist discourses today. But it seems to me that none of them have actually thought of a third option. Whether race is something that's fixed, biological, it's determined by skin color or genetics, whatever, or if it's something that's merely a social construct that has no intrinsic value. The third is, well, let's say race is fixed and it's biological and it's passed down from generation to generation. Why should that even matter when we're, determining a person's worth and value? We don't have to say that something is a social construct in order to get to the point where we are no longer denigrating people for the groups to which they belong, whether it be racial or gender. And I think this theology of the image of God, I think, in the way that the church fathers talk about this, can really kind of help us overcome some of that and remember that the individual has dignity regardless of his or her group or racial affiliation. So with that, I think my diatribe is over.
We'll just open that can of worms and then just shut it back down.
Yeah. But we should probably wrap it up. Any final words from you?
Man, I can't believe how quick the time goes when we get going.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Like I say, it's I would just really encourage people to dive into that for sure. Like you say, it's there's a whole lot there, and it's worth studying. There's a number of good books out there actually that deal with the image of God. So yeah, check them out.
Yeah. And don't forget, for the millions of viewers out there, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell right next to it, and also smash that like button so this video can, the YouTube algorithms can help spread this video throughout the interwebs and get us more viewers. So, and also, if you have any questions, if you have any ideas for topics you want us to discuss, let us know in the comments section below. If you hate us, let us know in the comments section below, and I'll be sure to fire Don the first thing the next day.
I think we actually have comments turned off, so good luck on that.
Okay, well, we'll have to turn them on next time. But anyways, yeah, thanks for tuning in, and until next time, Don, it's been real.
Good night. Thanks so much, and look forward to our